Hi, and welcome to my podcast for parents. My name is Anne Maxwell, and I'm inviting you to a space where you get to be who you are, not only as a parent, but as the amazing being you actually are. So, hello, and welcome to the very first episode of my podcast for parents. I'm so excited to have you here, and I'm so excited to actually be here. And I'd like to introduce to you a friend and colleague, Chelsey who I talk to almost every day because we work together.
I am
and when
lucky.
we were talking, we thought that it would be so much easier to have somebody introduce me. And then, so that's what we're doing.
So thank you so much, Anne. And thank you for doing this. So this first podcast is actually all about you.
Yeah, I know. That's
all about Anne. The story of Anne. Where did she start? How did she get to where she is now? And what are you up to?
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, cool.
I don't know about the rest of you, but it's a lot easier for me to pay attention to other people than it is for me. And so I brought in some help. So the podcast for parents. So I've been working as a licensed clinical social worker and a registered play therapist supervisor. And I've had a clinical practice for over 30 years at this point. And when Chelsey and I were talking, she said, you need to talk a little bit about yourself, like who you are. And I thought, okay, starting at the beginning, my mom used to tell this story when I was 4, apparently. I was at a birthday party with friends, and there were lots of parents there. And there was a mom who had twins who were probably, 6, 7 months old, who were really unhappy, who were crying and crying and crying. And the mom tried desperately to comfort them, rocking them back and forth, passing them on to other people, really kind people, and nothing worked. And my mom finally went over to her and said, why don't you ask Anne to sit down in the grass and put the babies next to her and see what happens. So the mom did, and the babies leaned up against me. And I don't know what I did, but they stopped crying. And I love that story because it has shown me over the years that actually is who I am, as opposed to the person that I thought I should be as I was growing up. I thought I should be this intellectual and this multilingual person who would marry a Frenchman and live in Paris and be an interpreter or translator or something. And all the groundwork to set up that imaginary future that wasn't set in place. And I spent my childhood in France, basically off and on over the summer, and then for high school, for 2 years of high school. And yet it never panned out. TMI, long story, very short, was that even though I majored in French in college, I managed to work in a daycare center where I had to get up at 4 a.m. to get there. And if you guys know anything about college back in the 70s, that was like unheard of. But I did it, and I loved working with those kids. And I ended up in Washington, D.C. That was sort of backup plans. And so I wasn't in Paris married to a Frenchman translating. I ended up in Washington, D.C.
Can I ask you something real quick?
Yeah, please.
So what do you think it was that made you think that that's what you should do? Like, why?
It's because I adored my mom. My mom and I were really close, and that was her life. She was multilingual, and she translated books, and she taught French, and we adored each other. And we were like the sane ones in the family, at least I thought we were. And so I became who I thought I needed to, or I tried to become who I thought I needed to be, right? I don't know whether any of the rest of you out there find yourselves in that situation. And I worked hard at it. I was pretty good at it. I'm bilingual and like I did all that stuff. But anyway, so that didn't work out. So I ended up in Washington, D.C., where again, my mom was working as a lobbyist. And I thought, all right, so I dove into national politics, and TMI, very long story, very short, is I was lucky enough to end up working with some of the most effective really honest, sort of statesman-like people who worked on the periphery of the big guys. And they hired me. And together we were able, this was just like, it was almost like an afterthought for them. It was my whole work, my whole job for a couple of years. But we ended up getting a $25 million program enacted into law. It was attached to the Head Start authorization and funding in, God, it must have been 1989, I think. And what it did was it provided funding for 20 projects across the country that funneled primary prevention and early intervention monies. So you may wonder what those are. Primary prevention. So it was targeted at the at-risk population. So kids who are at risk of failing in school, kids who are at risk because they grow up in this intense poverty where people don't break out and there's high crime and low education and like that kind of stuff. And the thinking behind the program was to see if resources were funneled into the moms and these kids and their families from the time the mom got pregnant. So prenatal care too, all the way to entry to kindergarten, to see whether it could have an effect on their performance in school.
Cool.
And yeah, and not very many people know that about me.
I was going to say the story today is the untold story.
I know, isn't that funny?
all the TMIs that are not TMIs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I was lucky enough to work with some of the best and the brightest, like I said, lobbyists in Washington, and we got this thing through, and I was so proud of it. And then it was time for me to go do something, which is what I really wanted to do after all these years, was to get credentialed so I could work with kids and families. And again, I had all the possibilities available to me, all different kinds of degrees that I could have gone after. And I went after social work because back in the day, I don't know whether that's still true, but 30 plus years ago, unless you got a PhD or a PsyD in psychology, the same opportunities weren't available to you as a master's level social work degree was. And I wanted to work directly with kids and families.
So was it the initiative in Washington that was the real sort of pivotal, okay, I can't deny this real true love that I have, which is working with children. That was the
it really was, because we affected the lives of untold numbers of kids and moms and families. And I lost track of it. You know, I went to grad school, but I had always wanted to work with kids. And this was a way for me to do that, where I could actually earn some money and
work with them directly.
Living. Like, not, you know, social work salaries weren't very high back then, and they still aren't, but I could earn a living doing what I'd love to do. And
really work directly with families and kids.
Yeah.
Would you, Anne, I hope I'm not jumping forward too much, but
no, you're good.
So as a licensed clinical social worker, you work directly with kids and families?
Yeah.
Is that always, that is it? That's always the job?
Well, it depends. Like in social work, there are really 3 tiers. One is the upper level policymaking, administrative level, which actually was the function that I had in Washington, even though I wasn't a social worker. But it's at that level of policymaking so that programs like that can get enacted. And the people who are trained in graduate school to work at that level are trained in policy and lobbying and administration and like that kind of stuff.
Okay.
And then there's a mid-level social worker, sort of mid-tier, which is the case management kind. Those are the social workers in departments of human services, Department of Social Services, like that kind of stuff, who work with kids and families in a multitude of different ways, everywhere from emergency, pulling kids out of unsafe situations, to working with families and kids in the foster system and the adopt system, like that kind of stuff. Typically, they have caseloads of, 10 to 12 kids over a pretty long period of time. Like, they really get to know them and they do that. And then there's the clinical level, which is the level that I was really interested in, which is direct clinical work with kids and with their families. And so those are the therapists that you see online when you're looking for a therapist, and they end up having gone to social work grad school. That's the level of sort of training that we received.
Okay.
And so that's the one that I chose.
Cool.
When I was in grad school. Yeah. And I was really lucky. Again, I ended up getting accepted at at a really wonderful graduate school in Denver. And I moved out here and I never left. I graduated in 91 and I'm still here. And I was lucky enough to work in all kinds of settings, both in grad school, it was at school, and that it was at an elementary school for the first year. And the second year was in the day treatment program at Colorado Health Sciences. So it was an incredible placement. And I went from there to a residential treatment center. And back in the day, I don't think they have very many of them anymore, but that's where kids get sent who, for a variety of reasons, cannot live safely in any family setting, whether it's their intact family or birth family, or however you want to call it, or foster family, or adoptive family, or even a group home. And those are the kids that get sent there. And if they blow out, back in the day, if they blew out of the residential treatment center, they either ended up in kid jail or long-term psychiatric care like the state hospitals. So those were the kids that were the toughest kids. And I love those kids. I worked there as a residential therapist for 6 years, maybe 7 years, something like that. And then I flipped over to the inpatient psych unit. And I always specialized in the little ones. They were always my favorites. I really am just a huge believer that the capacity to instill hope and change in a person is magnified the younger they are, because there's so much more willing and able, basically, to let go of whatever other stuff is going on and just choose something different. Anyway.
Later in the show.
Yeah, exactly. So I went from there to primarily inpatient psychiatric work in the kid and adolescent psych hospital. And I did that for 7 or 8 years. And then that was, I can't remember, back in the early 00s, residential treatment centers and inpatient psych units the funding became more sparse, and they gradually began to shut down or cut back on staff. That psych hospital and that residential treatment center is still open, but I ended up shifting over to outpatient therapy. And I did that for years, affiliated with, again, I've been so lucky over the course of my work. These guys were amazing, and some of the cutting edge practitioners of family therapy, and nobody in their practice worked with little kids. So I had the littles, and I was the only one with the toys in the play therapy room, and all my kids loved me, and all the adolescents hated their therapist. Not all. It was like a standing joke. What are you doing there? You give them candy or something? Because my kids would come running and, yay, we get to see Dr. Ann. And the other ones are like pouting in the. But anyway, so I did that. And then I opened up my own practice after
Which
that.
was play therapy.
Yeah. It's the Child and Family Play Therapy Center. Yeah.
Okay,
and
cool.
I had that for 3 years and then closed it down and did some other stuff for the last 8 or 10 years. And I've recently reopened my practice in a different place now. So cool. That's the thing. It's so funny when it's part of the reason that I want to do this podcast, is that sort of trajectory of my life of thinking that I should be somebody. Mm-hmm. And I love France, and I love speaking French, and I love traveling, and I love all that stuff. And what I really love more than anything else is working with kids and working with their families and their parents and like that. And that same thing that occurred in my world, I've seen it occur in the lives of so many of the parents that I've worked with. They have no idea who they are beyond being a parent, a spouse, a child, a relative, a partner. That's why I wanted to do this podcast.
For parents. Yeah.
For parents. We'll talk about whatever you guys want to talk about. And it's so much more than just talking about your 2-year-old throwing a tantrum last night and what you did didn't work. I mean, we can hit on that, but this is
For you.
for you. Yeah.
Cool.
It's almost like to give hope that no matter where you are, who you are, what's going on, what isn't going on, the hope that it can change, because it can.
And you've seen it,
I've seen
which is really cool. You know, I mean, gosh, I was going to say you must have so many stories.
I do.
And seeing real change happen with, yeah. Well, I mean, can you share something?
Yeah, it's such an honor to participate in this. So, as a play therapist, I'm not aware of anybody doing play therapy like I do. And I remember being challenged by one of my mentors who said, nobody does play therapy like you do. And I'm like, blah, blah, yeah, 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 yeah. And so I went off on the search to prove him wrong and to prove me right that everybody did play therapy. And turns out he was right. There, nobody does, and nobody did. And so my therapy practice evolved into what I refer to as family-centered play therapy. It hasn't been scientifically examined. I've not done control groups. I've not done any of that. It's just what I affectionately call the approach that I use with my families. And it, from what I could see, and again, I'm a seeker. I took every continuing ed credit that I could get my hands on. And there are some incredible people out in the world, Dr. Bruce Perry, Bessel van der Kolk. I mean, just, and we'll have a list of resources for you guys. Gabor Mate, there are some amazing people who have elements and approaches that really read with me, that I incorporate into my practice. And also some of the granddaddies of play therapy, Gary Landreth, who talks about how, if toys are words, then play is language. I'm fluent in the language of play. I'm also fluent in the language of parents. And a lot of what I do in my practice is translating for both of them, like what's really actually being said, what's really actually going on. But one of the elements of play therapy a long time ago was you don't have parents in the therapy room ever, that play therapy is for kids, not for parents. And then there's some approaches that if you do have parents in, it's pretty strictly scripted, you know, if the child says this, this is what you say back, you know, like that kind of stuff. And none of that ever worked for me. And then one notable moment, one day, I met with a grandma who wanted to bring her 3-year-old grandson in, who'd witnessed his dad trying to murder his mom. And he was unsuccessful, and he was in prison for the crime. She was in rehab for alcoholism. And this little guy had been living with a grandma for a while. So I met with a grandma first, and she's a formidable woman and really rocked. I don't know, as parents, if you can imagine a situation like that, but she was tugged and torn in all directions. And this little guy was clearly affected by his early years, because that was just sort of the culmination of a lot of violence at home. And she wanted the best for him. She was angry. And she was also really clear that she was a protector of this little guy. So, you know, I told her about my approach and like that kind of stuff. And again, she's formidable. She's also a lot taller than I am. And, you know, not heavy, but just
sturdy,
you know?
Yeah.
And I met the little guy in the waiting room, like the following week after that first session. And I said, hi. And he was so happy to meet me, because the grandma had been talking me up, and she has lots of toys and there's all kinds of stuff for you to do. And my office was right off the main waiting room, so the kids can always see the toys. And he's like, I clearly stepped out of that office, and he knew that's where we were going. And he bolts across the hallway into the corridor into my office. And I turned around and smiled and looked in the waiting room and kept on walking. And I went to close the door behind me, and it wouldn't close because the grandma was right there. And I thought, this was a first. And I knew this was not a woman to get into an argument with, like, ever. This was one that you really wanted to treat with all respect and kindness. Not that I wouldn't do it with everybody, but I'm not going to be firm with her at this point. So I welcomed her in, and she sat in a chair, and it turned out that she was crucial in the healing of this little guy. And her participation in the therapy, she really learned the language of play and the language of kids. And he felt really comforted having her in there. That was the beginning of what I call family-centered play therapy. She needed to be in there in order to know that he was okay and that I wasn't going to do bad stuff. And not only was she reassured by that, but she was also reassured by being able to see the progress that he made in the play and everything that he was able to share with us and to talk about with the toys, with the play. He had a sword, he kept on tapping the back of his head. And I asked the grandma what that was. Well, it turned out that his dad had smacked his mom, on the back of her head. And in the play was able to work through that,
Because she was there was that connection that they both, it's like they got to create a new something together with this new common language of play.
Yep.
Wow.
It was so cool. It was so cool. And, over time, the mom's alcohol treatment worked, and she gradually was reintroduced into his life. And then the three of them would be in the room together. And then gradually it was just the mom and the little guy. And they were able to form a new bond. It's like, one of the things that sort of the stereotype about therapy is that if bad things happen to you, bad things are going to happen to you in the future, and your past creates your future, and there's no hope. And it's like, oh my God, that's the worst thing in the whole world. And that's not my view. My view is that chapters close and other chapters open. And that chapter had ended, and they were creating a new one. They were creating a new story for themselves. And it was just awesome. And then to work with a grandma around letting go, around trusting whatever she knew about her daughter, not trusting that her daughter would never drink again, but trusting her instincts that if she ever saw her daughter start to waver, she would be able to trust it and step in, like to know that she had that capacity and she didn't have to project into the future some catastrophe that hadn't happened yet. Just, I guess, the capacity to be really present, and to trust herself. So cool.
Cool.
Anyway, like that, it's getting that information out really to parents. And the other thing is being able to talk about the real stuff. Like, that's real stuff, that goes on. And there's a lot of, oh, she threw a tantrum, or he did this, or he got kicked out of school, or whatever. But there's always a story. And there's always a story that I know for myself with the first 6 years of my life. I never wanted people to know that story. And yet it impacted me and my life and my life choices and everything that went on. And it really is giving people hope that you can change that stuff, that just because something has occurred in your life or the life of your family
doesn't mean it's forever.
Yeah, it really does.
Or that you're stuck on a certain path that's just never going to be able to change. And no matter how old you are, and because you've worked with all different ages of people, and of course with kids
of all different
primarily ages. But then also if you're working with the families and the parents and the grandparents, like really you're not just working with the kids. Mm-hmm. Hence the family-centered play therapy.
Yeah, I'll work with whoever comes in. And cool. That was just the name just because back in the day, there was really a dearth of play therapists in the Denver area. Now it's exploded and they're all over the place. And some of them are my best friends during play therapy training days. We took all the classes together and we were supervised by the same people, like that kind of stuff. So those kinds of bonds, and we've all opened up our own separate practices and stuff like that. But that was just the name, back in the day that in 2010, when I went out on my own and created my own business, that's what I called it. But I work with kids of all ages. And she's, how old is she now? Probably 18. When I started working with her, she was 15 and really bright IB student in school, really struggling with a lot of stuff. Like adolescence is a tough time.
And a tough time for parents.
Just tough time for everybody. I know.
Yeah.
Her mom is actually a really good friend of mine. So it's unusual that I would be her therapist. And I did make that exception just because it was fine. Like there was no thing. And her mom and I went out to dinner, I don't know, a couple of years ago. And she looked at me and a year and a half ago, she looked at me and she was crying. And she said, my daughter wouldn't be who she is and where she is right now if it weren't for you. You need to get out there. You need to tell more people on this stuff. But she's one of my favorite kids. And so long story short, it was after the work that we did when she was a freshman and then a sophomore in high school, was she ended up getting accepted at a high school / 2-year college program where at the end of it, you get an associate's degree in addition to a high school diploma.
Mm-hmm.
And, she's at Columbia now in New York City, taking classes and stuff like that. She's brilliant. She's lovely. And she was just not doing well at the local high school. She needed something different, and due in large part to her family.
I was going to ask, do you think that all these same changes can or could happen if you were just working directly with the kids?
What I would say to that is, for those of you who are therapists who are out there, who are working with kids who bounce from place to place, yes, keep working with a kid. There's a lot that's possible. And they only spend 45 to 50 minutes in your office, maybe once a week. And the rest of the time, they're someplace else. So yes, whatever tools you give them, whatever processing you help them with, whatever things that the two of you work on together, definitely open up doors, can instill hope in all of that. But to the extent that it's possible to connect with the caregivers of the kids, absolutely. Absolutely. It's really hard for kids to connect with me if I haven't connected with their parents, because they pick up on it and they'll just do a little bit of talk to the hand. Yeah, I'll be here because they want me to be here, but I'm not going to get close to you.
Right.
And, part of my first work always is wooing the parents, and not even in that sounds almost scummy. It's not scummy at all. It's like just getting to know them. They know their kids better than I ever will.
And that's really, that's everyone close to that. That can be grandparents, step parents, boyfriends of parents. Whoever. I think that's so important though, because I think for, single moms and dads out there, they don't maybe even get how much the family connects to each other and bounces off each other and can influence each other and be part of healing, as you put it. Right. So that's grandparents and foster parents and step parents and step moms, dads. Like, the term, it takes a village. Well, that village is influencing and connecting or not.
Yeah.
And it all creates something.
Yeah. No, it really does. And God, there was something I wanted. It just slipped right out of my head. Oh, so I have another story, because I'm just going to tell this story because a lot of times in my experience, kids have come to therapy because there were struggles going on in the family. So what ended up happening was that it was actually the parents that ended up coming in, and the kids were just the catalyst for that. So I remember in particular one 3-year-old who tantrums, fits, up at night, screaming and yelling, all this kind of stuff. And he wanted his mom in the room. So as part of family-centered play therapy, what I tell the kids is, in here, meaning the playground, you're the boss. Is that true at home? Are you the boss at home? And they go, no. I say, right. But in here, you're the boss. So if you want your mom in the room, your mom can be in the room. If you don't want her in the room, she's going to be happy waiting outside, reading magazines and talking to her friends on her phone, whatever, doing her thing. So this little guy wanted his mom in the room, and he would go off in the corner. And I would say to the mom, welcome. How's it going? And every time the kid needed to come in for therapy, he had acted out enough that his mom would make another appointment. It was when she was really struggling with stuff. So time after time after time, I would get the phone call. He's at it again. Can we come in? And I'd say, yes. I'd say, do you want your mom in the room? Yes, I want my mom in the room. And so she would come in and I'd say, how's it going? And she's white and ashen and upset and all this stuff. And he would go off in the corner and play. And periodically he'd turn around and look at us, but he just kept on playing. And the mom and I would talk. And over the course of the 45 or 50 minutes, she'd settle down. Her cells would glue back together again. She'd get color back in her face. And he'd come over at the end of the session and he'd give me a big hug, and off they go. Right? She was the one who really needed help. Mm-hmm. And he was the one who got it for her by acting out, right? Like that.
Wow.
It was so cool. And then whatever it was that was going on in her life that was making it so difficult abated. And I don't know, she either moved or broke up with a boyfriend or got a different, I can't even remember what it was at this point. All I remember is that little dude looking at me it's almost like kind of smiling at me from the other corner of the play therapy room.
He brought her to
happily
you.
With the toys as a 3-year-old, not dumping everything out, just playing with one little thing, knowing that he wasn't going to ruffle anything because he wanted his mom. I mean, that was the energy of it. He wanted his mom to get some help. And she did. But after every session, he'd give me a big hug. It would make me cry. It's like, oh.
Wow, what a brilliant little thing.
Yeah.
Gosh, cool.
Yeah. That's why I'm doing this podcast. It's for parents. I think there's some of the most misunderstood, most blamed, and many of them disconnected from that light that's within each of us, like who we actually are. Mm-hmm. And that's what this podcast is for, is just to talk about stuff, talk about ways of connecting, not only with everybody in your world, because as parents, we're all really good
at keeping it together
in the world, but actually connecting with ourselves, right?
Right.
Yeah. Because when you do that, worlds change.
So on that note, Anne, what will this podcast, what will we be talking about? What are we going to be, what kind of stuff are we going to be covering?
The first episode, the second episode, because this is the first, is going to be on connection. And I'm not quite sure all the parts of it, but we're just going to talk about connection and what that is. There are all kinds of things we can talk about. We can just talk about so many different kinds of things. What I'd love to really focus on, though, is parents. What about you guys? What was your childhood like? What did you learn? What are you really good at? What do you shy away from? What are your dreams? What were your dreams when you were little?
And the famous Anne phrase, which is, and what do you really, really love to do?
Right, exactly.
Which is my favorite. It's just that matters. I matter.
Yes.
Really? That matters. Yeah. That matters.
I'm,
as a mom, doing what I love to do.
Yeah. So, totally matters. Yeah.
Beautiful. Cool. Yeah. Well, thank you. Anne, thank you so much for having me.
And Chelsey, thank you so much for interviewing me. I couldn't have done it without you. This is sort of a big thing for me to even talk about myself.
I know.
I'll talk about anybody.
Well, thank you for sharing as much as you did. I actually think that you have a really beautiful story and you've gone through some stuff. And so it's really nice to hear you actually talk about it. So I'm grateful.
Thank you. And stay tuned. Thank you so much for listening. I'd love to hear from you. If you'd like, you can connect with me below in the comments section. And if you'd like more information about me, please go to my website at www.annemaxwellLCSW.com.